As always, a huge thank you to my patrons, especially Anders, who is our newest tome hunter. Thank you, Anders, and thank you, all of you. You make this possible. All right, hello everybody. New space. Well, I guess it's the same space. New arrangement, looking different, looking exciting. And a new author that I'm reviewing here on the channel. My first Neil Gaiman I have ever read. I finished The Ocean at the End of the Lane, a short novel, almost a novella from Gaiman, and I'm really excited to talk about this one because, let me tell you, I loved this book. It is a gorgeous adult fairy tale. And what do I mean by that? I mean the themes in here are absolutely adult. There's obvious allusions to sex. There is a little bit of body horror, like it's definitely not for children. And yet, at the same time, it has sort of the feeling of wonder and slight mystery and magic. Not that you'd find in a normal fantasy book, but in a sort of grim fairy tale-esque way, or a Hans Christian Andersen type way. A darker take on a real world thing. And another thing that I love about this book is the theme. Very much so what the theme of this book is the evil of adulthood. A tradition that goes back a lot of ways and a lot of different viewpoints. I mean, Jesus said in Christianity that you have to have the heart of a child to have faith. In a way, Neil Gaiman is getting at that idea that you have to preserve your heart of a child in some ways as you get to adulthood to keep the cynicism, the nastiness, the selfishness of adulthood away. There's one beautiful line here I wanted to read. This is, I'm going to not say the name, although it's pretty obvious who the bad person is, but this person smiled, and the lightnings wreathed and writhed around her. She was power incarnate, standing in the crackling air. She was the storm. She was the lightning. She was the adult world with all its power and all its secrets and all its foolish, casual cruelty. And that's what the brilliance of this book really is, that it is about the casual cruelty of adulthood and how harmful that is to our entire world. What's the actual story of this book? Let me back up. The actual plot is rather simple. It is a man who comes back to his childhood home, and as he does, these memories flood back to him of a time in his life where he met the residents at a farm at the end of his lane, where his house is. And it turns out that these people at the end of the lane have some sort of mysterious and magical inclinations. And that's really all that is needed for a starting off point, because as he gets to know these people, accidentally some evil forces are let into the world and start to affect the boy's life. And that's what happens in this book. And again, at the heart of that is that tension between childhood and adulthood. Not that adulthood is evil, but what about adulthood changes us from when we were children, when we saw the wonder of the world, when we cared for other people, and how that gets jaded. There's so much good stuff in here. What is done with the villain is brilliant. Gaiman was one of those authors that was highly recommended to me by a lot of different people that I sort of stayed away from. And I think the reason is, and this sounds petty and silly, but he is so respected in like the larger literary world that sort of scared me away from him as a fantasy author, because generally, I think this is wrong, but generally I think fantasy is looked down upon as a genre. And whenever someone tries to ride the line between like literary fiction and fantasy fiction, generally they lean heavily towards the literary side of things because, again, fantasy is generally not respected as much, has as much prestige. And so I was nervous that with Gaiman I was really just going to get a lot of literary fiction, which I like on its own, that sort of touched fantasy, which I didn't like. Because it feels almost, it sounds weird, but kind of a weird slap to the face to those of us who like fantasy. Anyway, I think I got a little too deep into that, but for that reason, I was nervous about Gaiman, but that is not what this book is at all. Yes, it is a little bit more literary in its heavy themes, and the story is rather simple, but that's what makes it beautiful, that beautiful fairy tale. For me, this is absolutely going to be a universal recommend. It's short and, as I say, simple, even though the themes are very deep and hit home. At least to me, it hit very hard. However, it's not quite to the point where I want to put it in best of all time, but I mean, it's fantastic. You should read it. You can literally read this in one sitting. Mine is like 170 pages, and you can see it's not like it's a super small text. So much fun, a lot to think of, and it's one of those stories that really stuck with me afterwards. I finished this a couple weeks ago, and I'm still, as I record this, and I'm still thinking back to particular scenes, to particular moments, to particular quotes, especially what I just read there about the casual cruelty and that being a villain, the casual cruelty of adulthood, and that being a villain in the story, but also a villain in our world. I think that's really, really valuable. So would highly recommend The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. Have you guys read it? My main question in the comments, besides like what you think of The Ocean at the End of the Lane, what should I read next? A lot of people really like American Gods. I know he has a graphic novel, Sandman. I'm not a huge graphic novel fan, but I liked things like Watchmen and a couple of the larger sort of omnibuses, so maybe I would like that. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Of course, as always, please subscribe, and if you haven't yet, check out my Patreon. I'm dropping original writings there, as well as behind the scenes footage. Every so often we do a live reading hangout together with people where we have a lot of good conversations, so check that out if you haven't. It's a great way to support me and what I'm doing. Thank you guys, as always, first in, last out.